I found out my husband of 20 years was cheating with my own sister, using our daughter's college fund to pay for it. When I told my parents, they called it a simple mistake and demanded I forgive them to protect the family name. They had no idea I'd already found the evidence and was about to start a controlled demolition of their entire world. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Look closely at this picture. It's a perfectly focused, slightly grainy cell phone selfie taken in a mirror that badly needed cleaning. He's leaning back against the headboard, his expression smug and satisfied, wearing that ridiculous silk robe I bought him for Christmas. She is nestled into his side, one hand, the one bearing the silver heirloom bracelet I passed down to her last year, resting possessively on his bare chest. That is Rick, my husband of 20 years. And that is Susan, my little sister. They weren't on some exotic, stolen vacation, testing the limits of their newfound passion hundreds of miles away. They were 3 miles from our suburban home, in a cheap, rented suite at the Marriott, happily, systematically destroying my life. The discovery itself, the sickening slideshow of images and texts I found logged onto Rick's old work iPad, was a physical blow. It was the moment the air left my lungs and the world tilted violently. But the real, soul-crushing shock, the devastation that fundamentally rearranged my molecular structure, came 2 hours later. In my parents' meticulously kept living room, the discovery itself, the sickening slideshow of images and texts I found logged onto Rick's old work iPad, was a physical blow. It was the moment the air left my lungs and the world tilted violently. But the real, soul-crushing shock, the devastation that fundamentally rearranged my molecular structure, came 2 hours later, in my parents' meticulously kept living room. I had driven straight there. I was covered in the sticky sweat of adrenaline and shock, clutching the tablet like a life raft. I laid the device on the mahogany coffee table, the glowing screen illuminating the faces of the 2 people I loved most in the world, the 2 people who should have been my unbreakable foundation. My father, usually so stoic and imposing, looked away first, his large hand trembling as he reached for the remote control as if to mute the horrible truth. My mother, the queen of our perfect little family facade, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing not in sympathy, but in cold, pragmatic calculation. I didn't need them to fix it. I just needed them to confirm the reality I was staring at, that this was wrong, that I mattered. My heart, already a cracked and bleeding mess, froze solid. A mistake? Mother, this has been going on for 6 months. They planned this. They rented a secret apartment downtown. They used the money Rick said was for Heather's college fund. We need to protect the family name, she insisted, her gaze locking onto mine, clinical and demanding. Think of your father's health. Think of Susan. She's fragile, Carol. She relies on us. She needs a stable family structure now more than ever. You, however, you are strong. You are capable. You can forgive this. In that moment, standing in the house I grew up in, begging for the basic human decency of support, I understood. Rick and Susan had been brutal, messy traitors. But my parents, they were the ultimate betrayers. They didn't choose me, the victim. They chose the appearance of stability. They chose the comfortable lie. They chose the reputation. The tears that had evaporated earlier returned, not as grief, but as a burning, purifying acid. I didn't need to cry. I needed to cut the cord. I gathered the iPad from the table, the weight of the evidence grounding me. I saw not my loving mother, but a stranger willing to sacrifice my dignity for a comfortable narrative. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, utterly stripped of warmth. You want me to be the bigger person? Fine. I will be the person who is bigger than your shame. I will be the person who protects the only family member who truly matters. My daughter. I left their house and drove away without a backward glance. I knew I was driving toward an uncertain future, but I also knew I was driving away from a past that was nothing but a beautiful, fragile lie built on sand. The family name they wanted to protect? I was going to burn it to the ground. And they would watch. Alone. The cold reality of the suburban landscape snapped into focus through the shield of my anger. Willow Creek. My perfect life. It felt like a stage set now. A beautifully crafted piece of theater where I had played the oblivious lead actress for 2 decades. Our home, number 412 on Hemlock Lane, was a testament to the illusion. It was a sprawling colonial, freshly painted, surrounded by impeccably manicured flower beds that were the envy of the neighborhood. Inside, everything was granite and stainless steel, warm oak and plush neutral fabrics. It wasn't a house. It was a sanctuary of stability. Purchased, decorated, and maintained by the joint effort of 2 people who believed they were building a fortress against the world. We were the couple everyone admired at neighborhood barbecues, successful, harmonious, raising a polite, high-achieving daughter. We weren't just surviving 20 years of marriage. We were thriving. We had just started drafting the guest list for our 20th anniversary party. A lavish, slightly over-the-top renewal of vows ceremony planned for the fall. And Rick? He was my anchor. He was the reason I slept soundly every night. He wasn't a volatile, unpredictable man prone to midlife crises. He was meticulously reliable. Rick was a respected financial consultant, a man whose entire career was built on minimizing risk and maximizing return. He handled our investment accounts, managed the mortgage, and always remembered to switch the security system on before bed. He had a quiet, self-assured charm that never felt needy or desperate. He provided. He protected. When I looked at Rick, I saw a future so steady and certain. I never felt the need to look over my shoulder. He was so dependable, so time-safe that the possibility of his malice was structurally impossible within the framework of my reality. He didn't stray because it was illogical, risky, and against everything he professed to be. That sense of security, I now realized, had been his greatest tool. But the facade wasn't built just on Rick's predictability. It was reinforced by my own misplaced loyalty to my sister, Susan. She was 5 years younger, the baby of the family, and perpetually defined by her fragility. She had dropped out of college twice, cycled through several unsustainable jobs, and lived in a constant state of emotional crisis. I, Carol, was the successful, grounded one. The one who paid her rent after a bad breakup, the one who drove her to doctor's appointments, the one who always had to be the bigger person, even before my parents demanded it. Her dependence was exhausting, but it felt meaningful. It gave me a role. The strong, protective sister. Rick understood this dynamic perfectly. When Susan moved into an apartment only a few blocks away, ostensibly to be closer to her support system, Rick was the one who helped her move the heavy boxes. He was the one who fixed her leaking faucet and taught her how to change a tire. It seemed natural. Rick was the handyman, and Susan was the helpless child. I even encouraged it. "Go help your sister, honey," I'd say, waving him off. "She really needs a male presence right now. She's too fragile to deal with that herself." Susan's proximity wasn't suspicious. It was convenient. She came over for dinner 3 times a week. She babysat Heather frequently. She was woven into the fabric of my perfect home. A familiar, non-threatening fixture who relied entirely on my goodwill and emotional bandwidth. She was too messy, too needy, too much of a project to ever be a threat to the polished certainty of my marriage. I had loved her, pitying her inability to grasp the stability I effortlessly maintained. I had given her my time, my support, and even the silver heirloom bracelet that was supposed to be passed to Heather. I had given her access to my life, my husband, and my trust. And she, the fragile little sister, had used the safe space I provided to systematically dismantle everything I valued, brick by well-placed brick. While I cheered her dependence on, the perfect picture wasn't just shattered. It had been rigged to explode from the very beginning. The dismantling wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, deliberate leak. Looking back, I could chart the exact seismic tremors that preceded the final, devastating collapse, and I realize now I willfully ignored every single warning sign. I thought they were just the inevitable settling noises of a 20-year-old marriage. Rick began arriving home later. Not so late that I questioned his fidelity, but late enough that dinner became a cold plate microwaved alone. The excuses were polished and plausible. The Lawson deal is ramping up. Or, quarter-end crunch honey. You know how it is. His energy, which used to be focused on me and Heather when he walked through the door, was now diffused, drained by some external force. He'd kiss me on the cheek, a dry, perfunctory press, and retreat to his den to finish up paperwork. It was during this time that he started forgetting things. Small, insignificant details that suddenly felt like markers of mental distance. He forgot that I only drank Pinot Grigio, not Chardonnay, after 20 years. He forgot the anniversary of the night we first met. A silly little tradition we had always honored with takeout and an old movie. When I gently reminded him, he just offered a quick, distracted apology, blaming the stress of the Lawson account. "My mind is mush, Carol," he'd say. And I would instantly feel guilty for bothering him. Susan's shifts were equally insidious. Her regular Tuesday night dinner dates were cancelled with increasing frequency. She claimed she was taking a new, intensive pottery class. Or that she was dating someone new, a nebulous, highly demanding guy named Marcus's, who required all her attention. "That's wonderful, Susan," I'd enthuse over the phone. "You deserve some happiness." In reality, the absence of her neediness was a relief. I took the quiet evenings as proof that my efforts to help her had finally paid off. She was standing on her own 2 feet. I never considered that those feet might have been standing on my husband's welcome mat. The first true ripple of doubt hit me one night in late September. It was nearly midnight, and I was reading in bed. Rick had come to bed an hour earlier, claiming exhaustion. But I heard the faint metallic ping times of a text message. He was sleeping on his side, away from me. I watched him. A minute passed, and the silence was broken by the soft, almost imperceptible sound of typing, the deliberate, thumb-only tapping of someone who doesn't want to wake their partner. A spike of ice pierced my chest. I pretended to stir, clearing my throat, and instantly, the typing stopped. Rick rolled over toward me. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice thick with feigned sleep. "Just having trouble settling," I lied, letting the silence stretch. He shifted uncomfortably. "Go back to sleep, honey. Big meeting tomorrow." I closed my eyes, but my mind was wide awake. I lay there, listening to his unnaturally heavy breathing, trying to rationalize the text message. A client? A colleague? Why the secrecy? Why not just text back openly? The intimacy of our shared darkness felt suddenly violated by the invisible conversation he had just been having. I wanted to reach over, grab his phone and scroll. But the fear of what I might find, and the subsequent shattering of the piece paralyzed me. The final piece of the puzzle, the catalyst that converted vague anxiety into cold, purposeful mission, was entirely accidental. It happened 2 weeks before our scheduled anniversary party planning session. I was cleaning out the rarely used guest room closet, looking for an old photo album I wanted to show Heather. Pushed to the back, underneath a pile of old tax returns, was a cracked leather laptop bag. Rick's old bag. The one he used before his company upgraded everyone to the newer, slimmer models. I pulled it out, intending to donate it. Inside the zippered front pouch, gathering a fine layer of dust, was his old work iPad. He had given it up about 6 months prior, claiming he'd wiped it clean before handing it over for disposal. Clearly he hadn't. Or the disposal instructions had been lost in transit. I sat on the floor, the heavy tablet resting in my lap. It was a relic from a past life. Our past life. My initial instinct was pure administrative duty. I should check it, make sure nothing sensitive remained, and then dispose of it properly. But beneath the surface of my practical reasoning, the dark knowledge I had been avoiding for months began to claw its way out. The hushed phone calls, the distant kisses, the forgotten anniversaries, Susan's sudden self-sufficiency. They all converged into a single, unbearable hypothesis. I didn't need to check it. I had times to check it. My hands were shaking violently as I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, displaying a login screen. Rick, being Rick, always used the same simple 4-digit PIN for all his secondary devices. I typed it in, watching the familiar home screen load. A pristine, corporate wallpaper, dozens of neat little work apps, and a forgotten photo gallery icon nestled in the corner. I didn't go to the gallery first. I went straight to the text messages, bracing myself for the professional correspondence I expected. Instead, the screen was filled with threads, all archived and saved, and there was one thread labeled simply, S. My breathing hitched. I recognized the font, the cheerful dolphin emoji she sometimes used. It was Susan. I tapped the thread, and the pristine facade of my life shattered instantly, irrevocably. The first message I saw, dated 6 months prior, wasn't about pottery or her new boyfriend. It was Rick's voice, clear and chillingly intimate. Asterisk, I'm already missing you. Did you make it home safe, my love? Asterisk, my love. The words, simple and tender, were a razor slice across the 20 years of honey and deer he had offered me. I scrolled down the thread labeled S. The texts didn't stop. They were a torrent. A relentless, daily conversation that charted a meticulously planned parallel existence. I read, not with the shock of initial discovery, but with the cold, scientific determination of a pathologist examining tissue samples. They had pet names for each other, not just my love but my Atlas and Siren. They discussed logistics, weaving their affair into the structure of my life. Asterisk, the Warden is out until 5 today. Picking up Heather from practice. Meet me at the usual spot. Asterisk, the Warden. I learned that the pottery class Susan was taking was actually a standing appointment at a tiny coffee shop, 4 blocks from Rick's office. I learned that Rick's late nights working on the Lawson deal were late nights spent hiding in Susan's apartment, consuming cheap wine and reveling in their shared secrecy. In one lengthy exchange, they openly mocked me. Susan complained that I was planning the 20th anniversary party, and Rick replied, asterisk, just play along. It keeps her occupied. She's so wrapped up in the image she built, she'd never look beyond the facade. Asterisk. The malice was breathtaking. It wasn't born of passion or even lust, it was born of contempt. They looked down on my stability, my trust, and the quiet life I had worked hard to build. My fingers, now steady, backed out of the message thread. I needed more than just words. I needed hard evidence that Miss Davis, the lawyer I already knew I would hire, could use to dismantle Rick's future as thoroughly as he had dismantled mine. I found an archived email folder labeled Taxes Q2. Inside, there wasn't tax information. There were statements for a dedicated joint checking account, linked to a throwaway prepaid phone, used solely for hotel reservations and dining. Rick had been moving $1,500 monthly, the exact amount he'd claimed was being invested aggressively for Heather's college fund, into this slush fund. This wasn't infidelity, this was organized financial theft, calculated and deliberate, targeting our daughter's future. The realization that this arrangement had been sustained for 6 months, half a year of constant communication, synchronized lies, and pilfered funds left me hollowed out. It wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was a dedicated, second marriage operating beneath the nose of the first. Finally, I clicked the Photos app. I had been bracing myself for this, but nothing prepares you for the visual evidence of your life being mocked. It was the digital graveyard of our marriage. There were hundreds of photos. Susan looking up at him with the doe-eyed fragility she reserved only for maximum effect. Rick, the strong, reliable provider, looking utterly besotted. They were in the Marriott suite but also in parks, restaurants, even inside my own home when I was supposedly out running errands. I recognized the corner of the guest room sofa in one picture. They had been intimate in the very room where I had just sat finding the evidence. A specific image froze my breath. A close-up selfie of Susan's hand covering Rick's heart. Her arm, wrapped possessively around his chest, clearly displayed the silver heirloom bracelet. The one my grandmother gave me. The one I trusted Susan with. I had admired it on her wrist just last month, thinking, asterisk, she finally feels stable enough to wear something so precious. Asterisk, the image of that bracelet, reflecting the flash, was the final, defining blow. I didn't scream or cry. I felt the cold, dusty floor of the closet pressing into my back, and I curled around the iPad, which was radiating a cold, guilty heat. The tears that finally came were not tears of grief for the loss of Rick, but tears of pure, incandescent rage for the woman. I had been the trusting fool who had confused reliability with loyalty, and weakness with innocence. I stood up. The tablet clutched to my chest. The shaking had stopped entirely. I didn't need Rick's apology or my parents' pity. I had everything I needed. I had the truth, documented, dated, and financially confirmed. I had the means to ruin them both, legally and reputationally. The soft light filtering into the guest room seemed irrelevant now. The quiet house, once my sanctuary, was just a structure. And in that structure, I was no longer the victim. I was the witness, the prosecutor, and soon, the executioner of their carefully constructed deceit. My campaign had just begun. The first thing I did after finding the iPad was achieve a terrifying, absolute calm. The shock had burned out, leaving behind a core of cold, dense steel. I didn't want a spontaneous explosion. I wanted a controlled demolition. I needed them to see the truth. And I needed to see their faces when they realized I was no longer the soft, naive wife they mocked as the Warden. I spent the next morning establishing the parameters of the ambush. I texted Susan first, using the tone of slightly flustered urgency I knew she would respond to. Asterisk, Mom just called, totally panicking about Dad's cholesterol results. She needs Rick's medical contacts for a second opinion. Can you meet us here at 5:30? We need to strategize. Asterisk. Susan always showed up for a manufactured crisis. It made her feel important, needed, and centered in the family drama. Rick was easier. I left a tight professional note on his desk. Asterisk, urgent financial matter. Something about the mortgage audit. Be home promptly at 5:30. Do not be late. Asterisk. He respected the language of risk management, and he knew a financial threat was non-negotiable. I arranged for Heather to have a sleepover at her friend Maya's house. By 5:20 p.m., the house was silent, pristine, and prepared. I set the mahogany coffee table, the same one where I had pleaded with my parents hours earlier, with 3 glasses of water. I placed the iPad, face down, precisely in the center. Rick arrived first, looking harried but in control. Audit? What audit, Carol? Everything is fine with the mortgage. Did you get a strange letter? Just sit down, Rick, I said, my voice unnervingly smooth. I was standing by the fireplace, my hands resting lightly on the mantel. I felt tall, remote. Susan walked in 3 minutes later, carrying a large designer shopping bag, utterly oblivious. Oh, thank God. Did Mom seriously have a meltdown? Is Dad okay? What kind of contacts does he need? She paused, sensing the atmosphere. Rick and I were both staring at her, but our expressions were utterly blank. What is this? Susan asked, dropping her shopping bag onto the pristine white rug. I didn't move. I simply gestured toward the coffee table. We're discussing the true time state of our family finances, Susan, and our structural integrity. Rick followed my gaze to the iPad. For a second, his composure wavered, his eyes darting frantically from the device to my face. He knew the specific weight of that forgotten work tablet. I think there's been a mistake, Carol, Rick started, his tone sliding instantly into the familiar, calming, corporate voice he used to de-escalate angry clients. Maybe we should talk about this privately. Susan, honey, perhaps you should step out for a minute. No, I interrupted, my voice cracking the air like thin ice. Susan stays. She's an active participant in our finances, apparently. And in our lives. I walked to the table, flipped the iPad over, and tapped the screen. The first image was the selfie from the Marriott suite. Susan draped across his bare chest. The silver heirloom bracelet glinting on her wrist. The photo was large, undeniable, and saturated with their shared smug happiness. The silence that followed was a physical entity, heavy enough to crush bone. Susan went white, her composure dissolving into rapid, panicked breathing. She stumbled backward, clutching her throat. Rick, however, chose denial. "Carol, that's photoshopped. Or it was a joke. A stupid, drunken mistake. Months ago. We can fix this." I didn't look at him. I scrolled once, quickly, showing the scrolling thread of intimate texts labeled S. I scrolled again, showing the screenshot of the joint checking account, the funds stolen from Heather's college savings. "This," I stated, pointing at the evidence of financial theft, "was not a mistake. This was a parallel life, 6 months long. It was calculated fraud, executed with malice and contempt. And it involved my daughter's future." Rick finally deflated, dropping onto the sofa, covering his face with his hands in a grand theatrical gesture of self-pity. "I know, Carol. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I've been under so much pressure at work." It was a lapse. A momentary, "Stop," I commanded. "Don't insult me with the midlife crisis trope. Save the excuses for your lawyer. I want to hear from Susan." Susan was no longer panicked. She had watched Rick crumble, and the sight seemed to steel her spine. She pushed a lock of hair from her face and met my gaze, not with remorse, but with sharp, cutting resentment. "You know what happened, Carol?" Susan's voice was suddenly hard, stripped of its fragile veneer. "I happened." And Rick finally saw what he was missing. "And what was that, Susan? An extra helping of your manufactured helplessness?" A cold smile touched her lips. "Passion. Excitement. Risk. You, Carol, you suffocated him with your safety. You built this perfect life, this perfect house, this perfect career, and then you sat back, assuming he was yours because you minimized all the risks." She walked toward me, invading my space, her eyes burning with long-held fury. "You always had to be the best, didn't you? The smartest, the most stable, the one Mom and Dad relied on? You were too safe, too predictable. You were the warden, holding him prisoner in your perfect little suburban cage." She jabbed her finger toward the iPad. "I gave him what you couldn't. I gave him the thrill of the secret. The fact that he could risk everything for me. That's how he knew it was real. You were so busy being the good wife, you forgot how to be interesting." The words weren't painful because they were true. They were painful because they exposed the deep, festering jealousy I had unknowingly fed for 20 years with my pity and support. This wasn't about love or sex. It was about her need to conquer what was mine, to finally step out of the shadow of the successful older sister. "That bracelet?" I said, pointing to her wrist, my gaze locked on the silver band. "My grandmother's. I gave that to you because I loved you. I trusted you to value it." Susan scoffed, turning her wrist so the metal caught the light. "Oh, I value it. I value the fact that it was on my wrist when I was sleeping with your husband 3 miles away from your house. It was a symbol, Carol. A reminder that no matter how many layers of perfection you built, I could still walk right through the front door and take what I wanted." Rick started sobbing in earnest on the sofa, realizing the situation had escalated far beyond an easily forgiven mistake. I looked from Rick's pathetic misery to Susan's aggressive triumph. In that moment, I wasn't angry. I was finished. The love, the regret, the confusion all gone, only a devastating clarity remained. "Get out of my house," I told Rick, my voice low and completely steady. He lifted his head, tears streaming down his face. "Carol, please. We need to talk about separation. Mediation." "No, we will not talk. We will communicate through my attorney. Tonight, you gather whatever pathetic belongings you can carry in a duffel bag. And you leave this property. If you set foot back here without my legal counsel present, I will call the police and file a restraining order based on the evidence of financial malfeasance against my daughter. He swallowed hard, recognizing the finality in my tone. I turned to Susan, my gaze sweeping over her, dismissing her entirely. You, I said. You have achieved your goal. You are no longer in my shadow. You are now merely a co-conspirator in a case of legal and financial ruin. Enjoy the spotlight. Now, get your shopping bag and get out. Susan opened her mouth ready for a parting shot. But the cold authority in my eyes silenced her. She snatched up her bag, gave Rick a final panicked look, and fled the house. I watched Rick drag himself off the sofa. He didn't try to touch me. He didn't try to apologize again. He just went to the closet, pulled out a small travel bag, and began shoving clothes into it. The image of his self-assured, reliable persona completely shattered. I stood there, listening to the muffled sounds of his departure. The house was finally clean. The treacherous foundation had been exposed, and the demolition was underway. But the quiet certainty of my victory was immediately poisoned by the bitter taste of knowing the ultimate, sickening truth. The two people who were supposed to be my safe harbor were the ones who had actively worked with the enemy to sink the ship. The silence Rick left behind was not an empty one. It vibrated with a metallic, aggressive certainty. The first part of the operation was complete, but I was not truly free until I severed the remaining, deeply toxic tether. I needed to ensure that my parents understood the irrevocable finality of my actions, and that their earlier dismissal had not deterred me. It had only fueled the fire. I drove the short distance to their house again, but this time, the car didn't feel like a chariot of grief. It felt like a tank of cold resolution. The sun had set, and their house, bathed in the soft glow of meticulously placed landscape lighting, stood like a defiant monument to the perfect suburban narrative. My mother answered the door immediately, her face tight with anticipation. She must have spoken to Susan or Rick, or simply anticipated the fallout. She didn't hug me. She stepped back and let me walk into the living room, where my father was sitting exactly where he had been hours earlier, gripping the remote like a weapon against uncomfortable reality. "Carol, thank God," my mother hissed, pulling the door shut. "What have you done?" Susan just called, sobbing hysterically. "She said you threw Rick out." I remained standing in the center of the plush oriental rug, refusing the invitation to sit and participate in their comfort. "I didn't throw Rick out, Mother. I gave him the option of leaving peaceably before I called the police for filing a report on financial fraud and embezzlement of Heather's college fund. He chose to leave." My father finally dropped the remote. "Fraud? Carol, this is madness. You can't ruin a man's career over a marital spat. People talk about these things. What will the neighbors say?" "The neighbors will say that my husband and my sister are immoral, calculated traitors," I retorted, the volume of my voice startlingly steady. "And I don't care what they say. What I care about is setting up the legal framework to protect my daughter. I have retained a lawyer, Miss Davis. We are filing for divorce and fighting for full custody and the immediate restructuring of all joint assets." The blood drained from my mother's face. "A lawyer? Carol, think. Do you have any idea how much scandal this will cause? Your father's position at the club, Susan's reputation, this will follow us all for years. We explicitly told you to be the bigger person. I was the bigger person for 20 years. I stated, looking straight at my mother. I was big enough to forgive Susan her debt, big enough to believe Rick's lies, and big enough to prioritize your comfort over my own truth. That version of Carol is dead." My mother moved closer, her voice dropping into the familiar register of emotional blackmail. "You are acting out of spite, Carol. Don't be so dramatic. Susan is fragile. She's had a difficult life. She genuinely loves Rick. Perhaps she needs him more than you do. You are strong. You have your house, your career. Why can't you just separate quietly, give them your blessing, perhaps a financial settlement, and let us all move on. The cold calculation of her suggestion that I should financially subsidize the relationship that stole my life was the last straw. The betrayal wasn't just in the failure to support me. It was in the active demand that I sacrifice my dignity for their convenience. So, the family name must be protected, I summarized, nodding slowly. And the cost of that protection is my complete silence and submission. Is that correct? My father cleared his throat, leaning forward with the patriarchal authority that had always ruled our family. It's about stability, Carol. You need to understand that Susan relies on us. Rick relies on her. If you destroy them, you destroy part of our structure. We cannot afford that instability. We are family. You forgive. That is what family does. He used the word forgive like a mandate, a command from a deity. I looked at their faces, the fear of scandal trumping genuine concern. The deep-seated preference for appearance over their own daughter's devastating pain. I saw 20 years of subtle emotional manipulation. The careful positioning of me as the resilient rock who could always absorb the impact. While Susan was the delicate flower that required protection, this was not a mistake born of momentary weakness. This was a defining philosophy of their parenting. You are absolutely right, I said. A faint, chilling smile touching my lips. Family forgives, family supports, and family does not sacrifice one member's soul for the comfort of another. You did not choose me. You chose the facade. And you chose the people who actively worked to destroy me. I took a deep, steadying breath. Consider this my final message. I am getting divorced. I am fighting for everything they stole from me and from Heather, and I am cutting off all contact with both Rick and Susan, permanently. Effective immediately. My mother gasped. Carol, you can't cut off your sister. We are your parents. This is an overreaction. Think about the holidays. Think about your father's heart. I am thinking of my father's heart, I agreed, meeting her eyes without flinching. And I realize that subjecting myself to your judgmental silence and Susan's calculated malice is far more damaging to my time's peace than any potential heartbreak you might suffer from the gossip. You asked me to be the bigger person. I am now bigger than your entire fragile ecosystem of lies. I pulled my car keys from my pocket and walked toward the door. Carol, stop! My mother pleaded. We won't talk about them. We promise. Just stay in our lives. It's too late for promises, Mother, I said, turning the doorknob. You showed me your priorities when I needed you most. You chose reputation over righteousness. You chose the lie over your daughter. I cannot be part of a family that requires me to sacrifice my self-respect to maintain its narrative. I walked out, closing the door behind me with a soft, definitive click that sounded louder than any gunshot. I got back into my car and drove. Not toward the house I still legally shared with Rick, but toward the friend's house where Heather was sleeping. I needed to see the one person left in my life whose love was pure and unconditional. The road ahead was daunting: legal battles, financial upheaval, the painful restructuring of a lifetime, but the heaviest burden had just been lifted. The obligation to perform as the dutiful daughter and the supporting sister. I was truly, completely alone. And in that crushing solitude, I found a terrifying, liberating freedom. I was no longer fighting to save a life. I was fighting to build an entirely new one. Free of the toxic influence of every single person who had betrayed me. My new family motto was simple. No apologies, no compromises, and absolute boundaries. I did not go to my parents' house to seek comfort, and I did not leave their house feeling sadness. I left feeling surgical, clean, and terrifyingly free. The final toxic thread had been cut. My first order of business was to secure the perimeter of my newly reclaimed life. I drove straight to the 24-hour hardware store, bought a set of heavy-duty locks for every door, and a new security panel for the alarm system. Rick had been gone for less than 24 hours, but that was 24 hours too long to trust his access. It took me an hour to replace the locks myself, working with a relentless, mechanical focus that bypassed grief entirely. I didn't feel like a heartbroken wife. I felt like a homeowner protecting her property. The metallic times, snick times of the new deadbolts sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had heard all year. I changed the alarm code to my maiden name's initials followed by Heather's birth year, something Rick would never, ever guess. The next morning, while Heather was safely at school, I drove downtown. I wasn't looking for a therapist or a support group. I was looking for a gladiator. I found her in a modernist high-rise that smelled of expensive leather and ruthless ambition. Miss Davis, the city's premier divorce attorney, was legendary for her 90% win rate and her zero-tolerance policy for emotional baggage. She specialized in high-asset, high-conflict divorces, and her fees reflected her status. Astronomically high. Payable in advance. She was exactly what I needed. Miss Davis's office was minimalist, all glass and polished stone. She was a precise woman in her early 50s, wearing a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, magnified slightly by thin, rectangular glasses, held an expression of detached, almost bored calculation. She offered no pity, no gentle platitudes, and didn't even pretend to be interested in my feelings. She was interested in the facts, the evidence, and the strategy. I sat across her mahogany table, laid the iPad between us, and began my recitation. I told her the full story. The 20 years of trust, the 6 months of calculated infidelity, the financial theft targeting Heather's college fund, Susan's calculated malice, and finally, my parents' unforgivable rejection. My voice never wavered. I spoke the truth like a police report, dispassionate, chronological, and damning. Miss Davis listened without interruption, occasionally making a brief cryptic note on a small legal pad. When I finished, she didn't offer a sympathetic sigh or a validation of my pain. She simply tapped the screen of the iPad. Carol. Embezzlement from a child's dedicated account is not simply grounds for divorce. It's grounds for full moral and legal leverage. It negates any goodwill he might claim in mediation. You have built a remarkably solid case before even stepping into my office. She finally looked up, her gaze piercing. Let me be clear. We will not be seeking mediation, we will be seeking victory. You want the house, full primary custody, and the maximum legal advantage to ensure Heather's stability. Is that correct? That is correct, I confirmed. I want full control over our daughter's life, and a physical space free from his past influence. The house stays, he goes. Excellent. We file tomorrow. We will serve him at his office, ensuring maximum professional discomfort. We will be seeking restraining orders regarding access to all liquid assets and bank accounts immediately. Citing the evidence of his misappropriation of funds, we will portray him not as a cheating husband, but as a financially reckless and morally corrupt co-parent. His affair with your sister merely adds a delicious layer of contempt, but the money is what wins the war. She spoke of my life's destruction with the enthusiasm of a general planning a flawless campaign. I paid her retainer, signed the necessary documents, and walked out feeling an exhilarating sense of professional security. Miss Davis was the armor I didn't know I could wear. Driving home, I realized the house still contained hundreds of tiny lingering reminders of the lie. The physical security was established, but the emotional purge had to be completed. I spent the rest of the day systematically erasing all evidence of my former family. I started in the living room, grabbing the stack of photo albums from the coffee table. I didn't destroy them. I wanted no visceral reaction. I simply removed them, placing them neatly into a large sealed plastic bin, and storing them in the farthest reaches of the attic. They were artifacts of a failed experiment, not worth looking at again, but preserved as a cautionary tale. The worst part was the mantelpiece. It held a row of framed portraits. Our wedding photo, Heather's first communion, and a large, recent portrait taken last Christmas. Rick, me, Heather and Susan, all smiling brightly under the false glow of holiday lights. I took the portraits down. I didn't look at Susan's smiling face or Rick's dependable smirk. I simply unframed them, placed the glass and frames in a recycling bin, and shredded the photos themselves, watching the paper curl and tear into unrecognizable scraps. The act was swift and brutally necessary. When I was done, the mantel was bare. It looked sterile, cold, and utterly empty. But for the first time in 2 decades, the air in my own home felt clean enough to breathe. The illusion of the Willow Creek facade was gone. It was just a house now, a valuable asset, and soon, it would be solely mine and Heather's. The only love that mattered was already here. I was ready to fight. The legal campaign began with the precision Miss Davis had promised. The divorce papers, coupled with the detailed evidence of financial misappropriation, and the immediate freeze on all joint liquid assets, landed on Rick's desk at his downtown office at precisely 9:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was a calculated strike, designed not merely to notify him, but to humiliate him among his colleagues and disrupt his professional certainty. He retaliated almost instantly, not with remorse, but with pure, panicked fury. Rick hired a lawyer known for aggressive, scorched-earth tactics, a cheap mimic of Miss Davis, but one who specialized in muddying the waters. Within a week, the first shots were fired back, motions contesting the asset freeze, predictable attempts to gain temporary, shared custody, and worst of all, a vicious whisper campaign targeting my credibility. Suddenly, I wasn't the grieving, betrayed wife. I was being painted as the emotionally unstable, controlling woman who had driven her reliable husband into the arms of a kindred spirit, Susan. Rumors circulated through Willow Creek's social media groups that I had always been cold, that I had refused intimacy, and that my sudden, dramatic legal maneuvering was simply a calculated attempt to claim maximum financial reward after failing as a partner. Let them talk, Miss Davis advised during our weekly briefing, her pen hovering over the financial statements. Gossip is the enemy's desperate weapon when they have no legal ground. We have the evidence, Carol. They have melodrama. She treated the smear campaign like background noise. Her focus was laser-sharp on the numbers. Rick, knowing his career depended on looking financially sound, was frantically attempting to hide assets through complicated transfers and dubious business expenses. But Miss Davis was always 3 steps ahead. He moved $50,000 into an account labeled hedge fund management fee, she noted, sliding a printout across the table, conveniently dated 2 days after times he was served. We filed an emergency motion this morning. That money is now frozen. He is panicked and making amateur mistakes. Your job is to stay quiet, stay clean, and let me catch him. The most irritating aspect of the opposing counsel's strategy was their insistence on trying to drag Susan into the proceedings. Rick's lawyer attempted to position her as a key witness, a benevolent third party who could attest to my alleged emotional coldness. Susan, for her part, seemed delighted by the attention, reportedly granting interviews to neighbors and claiming she was only trying to mediate the unfortunate breakdown of my marriage. Miss Davis dismissed it with a wave of her hand. Susan is irrelevant, she stated firmly. She is not legally married to him, she has no standing in our divorce, and her testimony about your marriage is hearsay, tainted by her direct involvement. We will make sure the judge views her involvement exactly as it is, the pathetic attempt of a co-conspirator to gain legitimacy. We will not mention her name in court unless necessary to confirm the theft of the heirloom bracelet and the fact that she was actively involved in diverting Heather's funds. This was the core lesson I learned from Miss Davis: compartmentalization. Emotions were a weakness, a liability in the courtroom. I was not allowed to feel hurt by Rick's desperate attacks or Susan's malicious joy. I had to view them as pieces on a chessboard. Rick was a high-value piece we needed to capture. Susan was a pawn we needed to sweep aside. I began to enforce this clinical detachment in every aspect of my life. When I received a scathing, poorly written email from Rick attempting to blame me for his professional struggles, I didn't read past the first line. I immediately forwarded it to Miss Davis with a single word: asterisk, actionable, asterisk. The true test of my newfound control came late one Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks into the battle. I had taken Heather to the upscale farmers market, an innocent, mundane outing that felt essential for normalizing our lives. We were browsing the organic produce section when I felt the air shift, tightening into a metallic knot of dread. I turned slowly. There they were. Rick and Susan, browsing the artisanal cheese stand, looking far too comfortable together. Susan was wearing a pair of sunglasses perched on her head and laughing at something. Rick whispered, her hand resting casually on his back. They looked like a couple in the honeymoon stage, radiating a confidence that suggested they believed their actions had been entirely justified. My heart hammered once, a painful, urgent thump. But then the Miss Davis training kicked in. Compartmentalize. You are the homeowner, the mother, the asset holder. They are trespassers. Susan saw me first. Her smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of triumphant malice, quickly masked by a performative look of sadness. Rick's eyes widened, and he froze, dropping a small basket of berries. Heather, thankfully, was still inspecting a pile of apples, her back to them. Rick started to move toward me, clearly intending to launch into one of his practiced, pseudo-sincere apologies or, worse, a public confrontation. I didn't wait. I didn't acknowledge Susan at all. I met Rick's eyes with a steady, utterly vacant stare. There was no anger, no grief, just the cold, hard recognition of an opponent. I did not speak. I simply reached into my oversized market bag, pulled out a small printed document, a restraining order update I had coincidentally received from Miss Davis that morning, and held it up slightly, just enough for him to register the logo of the firm and the legal language. The message was clear. I am armed. I am ready. Do not approach. Rick stopped dead in his tracks. The sight of the legal document, coupled with the absolute lack of emotion in my face, visibly broke his nerve. The public place, the potential for a scene, the reality that I was no longer the wife who would cry and beg it all hit him. He swallowed hard, his cheeks flushing crimson, and he quickly turned Susan away from me, steering her roughly toward the exit. Susan, shooting one last glare of thwarted aggression over her shoulder, stumbled along. They did not buy the cheese. They simply fled the market, defeated by a printed sheet of paper and my calculated silence. Mom, what was that? Heather asked, finally turning around, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded 30 feet away. Nothing, honey, I said, my voice steady. I forced a small, genuine smile. Just a man who dropped his berries. Now, are we getting Granny Smith or Fuji today? We need to make pie. I turned my back on the market entrance, dismissing the entire encounter from my mind. The old Carol, the wife, would have been shaking, devastated, or furious. The new Carol, the client of Miss Davis, felt only a dull satisfaction. They were ugly, they were pathetic, and they were quickly becoming irrelevant to the legal structure of my future. The fight was dirty, but I was learning to fight cleaner, colder, and infinitely more effectively. My armor held. The house, the custody, and the peace, they were non-negotiable prizes. And I was prepared to watch every part of their lives burn if it secured the foundation of mine. The confrontation at the market, though brief, left a cold, metallic residue, but when I turned back to Heather, the temperature in my soul immediately warmed. She was my litmus test, the single, fragile piece of this entire operation that could not be handled clinically. I wasn't fighting for the house or the assets for their own sake. I was fighting for the sanctuary of her future. Heather was 13. A complicated, intense age balanced precariously between childhood trust and adolescent cynicism. I had told her Rick was moving out permanently shortly after the initial discovery, sticking strictly to the truth that he and I had grown apart and were making decisions to secure her stability. I did not mention Susan, the fraud, or the full ugly scope of the betrayal. She didn't demand details. Instead she asked, "Will we keep the house? My friends are here." And later, "Does this mean Aunt Susan won't be coming over anymore?" Her concerns were pure logistics, safety, stability, and the removal of a known variable she subconsciously sensed was unhealthy. She was looking for an anchor, and in answering her questions with absolute, reassuring certainty, I solidified my own resolve. I was fighting for the ability to tell her, asterisk, yes, we are keeping the house, yes, you are safe, and no, the people who hurt us will never be close to you again. Asterisk. This fight wasn't about Rick's downfall. It was about Heather's elevation. Her maturity, far exceeding her years, often felt like a painful reflection of my own absence of support. She had internalized the drama of the last few months with quiet resilience. When I explained the need to distance ourselves from her grandparents, she didn't mourn the loss of the relationship. They always liked Susan best, she observed one night, lying on her bed while I helped her study history. She said it without bitterness, just as a simple statement of fact she had processed long ago. Susan needs them more. This casual acceptance of the imbalance in my parents' love was the most damning evidence of their failure. I had protected Heather from the details of the affair, but I couldn't protect her from the generational legacy of favoritism and emotional neglect. Her observation reinforced my decision to sever the cord completely. I was breaking the cycle. Heather would never have to play the role of the strong one, while the rest of the family indulged the fragile ones. To mark this new beginning, this authentic, unburdened chapter, we decided to symbolically reclaim the space that had been most corrupted by Rick's secrecy. His former home office, a small dark den dominated by heavy mahogany and a deep leather sofa, was the room where he spent many a late night texting Susan. Right under my unsuspecting roof, we stripped it bare. We rented a sander and took turns smoothing out the dark wood desk he'd been so proud of. We chose a bright, almost aggressive shade of seafoam green for the walls, a color Rick would have hated, viewing it as entirely too frivolous for a man's professional sanctuary. We threw out the heavy oriental rug and replaced it with a patchwork of colorful, vibrant runners. The goal wasn't just renovation. It was exorcism. We dedicated the room to Heather's passions. She was an avid reader and an enthusiastic, if messy, artist. We filled the reclaimed bookshelves not with financial texts or corporate manuals, but with her chaotic, joyful collection of graphic novels, half-finished watercolor canvases, and sculpting tools. One afternoon, standing amid the glorious mess of paint cans and new pillows, Heather was perched on a step stool, hanging a brightly painted canvas she'd finished months ago, a vibrant, abstract piece completely unlike the neutral tones of the rest of the house. "It looks like us now," she commented, stepping back to admire her work. "What looks like us, honey?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe, suddenly feeling more present in my home than I had in 2 decades. "The room," she said, turning to me, a streak of green paint on her nose. "It used to look safe, but it was just boring. Now it looks real and happy." Real? That was the word. The Willow Creek life had been safe and boring, a beautiful lie designed to prevent risk. This new life, built on the rubble of betrayal, was messy, imperfect, and entirely authentic. It was a space defined by our choices, our colors, and our uncompromised truth. We finished the afternoon by ordering 2 large pizzas and collapsing onto the newly positioned, absurdly comfortable beanbag chairs in the corner. Eating straight from the box, we laughed at the absurdity of the situation, the chaos of the paint splatter, and the sheer joy of ownership. In that moment, watching her, I understood the true victory Miss Davis was fighting for. Not the assets, but the peace. The calm certainty that the ground beneath our feet was firm because we had cleared away the sand and built the foundation ourselves. Rick and Susan were fading into the background, the distant buzzing noise of a war I had already won in my heart. My only focus now was ensuring this new foundation, built for Heather, was utterly, fiercely unbreakable. 6 months passed in the strange, disorienting quiet of steady legal warfare. The silence in the house, once an aggressive void left by Rick's departure, had finally settled into a comfortable, productive hush. Miss Davis and her team were making methodical, brutal progress. The house was now legally ours, The primary custody battle was virtually won, and Heather and I had built a routine so solid it felt like a bunker. We had the peace I fought for. A peace earned not through forgiveness, but through absolute unflinching boundaries. I had successfully excised the toxins. My parents' calls, after the initial storm of pleading and guilt, had tapered off to infrequent, stiff messages left on the answering machine, always addressed to Carol and Heather, never mentioning the exiled traitors. I never returned them. This hard-won stability felt utterly, fiercely unbreakable. Until the phone rang on a bright Tuesday afternoon. While I was going through escrow documents, it wasn't Rick, it wasn't Miss Davis, it was my mother. The caller ID shocked me, but her voice, when I finally answered, was unrecognizable. It was high-pitched, thin and hysterical, the sound of true, genuine terror, stripped of all her usual polished composure. "Carol, you have to come, please. It's your father." The words struck me like a physical blow, bypassing the rational guarded core I had built. "What happened, Mother?" I demanded, grabbing a pen so tightly my knuckles turned white. "His heart. He collapsed this morning during his tennis game. A massive attack. They took him to St. Jude's. Carol, I don't know what to do. The doctors, they said it's very bad." My world, which had been so firmly tilted toward my future, spun back toward the dangerous past. My father, the man who had refused to support me, the patriarch who had valued his reputation above my dignity, was now lying vulnerable and broken in a hospital bed. In all the devastation Rick and Susan caused, I had severed every tie except the one that lay deepest and most unspoken, the residual complex love I held for my father. He was flawed, yes. But unlike my mother, his rejection had felt born of fear and misguided tradition, not calculated malice. He was the anchor of my childhood, however shaky his support had been in adulthood. My perfectly constructed armor instantly cracked. I knew, with a painful, immediate clarity, that I had to go. I left Heather with Mrs. Henderson next door, offering only the brief explanation that there was a family emergency. Then, before I even grabbed my keys, I called Miss Davis. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and businesslike. I relayed the bare facts of the heart attack. "This is an emotional landmine, Carol," Miss Davis stated, her tone sharp. "Your parents will see this as an opportunity for reconciliation, leveraging your grief and guilt. Your mother will be especially vulnerable. And I assure you, Susan will be there, playing the grieving, vulnerable niece. You cannot let them pull you back into their toxic dynamic." "What should I do?" I asked, hearing the tremor in my own voice. "You go because he is your father. That is non-negotiable. But you go as a visitor, not a participant. You are there for him, and only him. No discussion of the divorce, no apologies offered or accepted. If they try to engage on those topics, you shut it down instantly. You are a rock, Carol. You are present but unavailable for emotional manipulation. If Susan is there, you ignore her existence. You maintain the line, understood?" "Understood," I said, the word a promise to myself. The journey from Willow Creek to St. Jude's Hospital felt like crossing enemy territory. I drove, visualizing my boundaries like concrete walls. Miss Davis's words, the blueprint for my defense. The surgical waiting room was dim and sterile, smelling faintly of old coffee and fear. The usual noise of my life, the rustling of legal documents, the cheerful chatter of Heather was replaced by an oppressive silence punctuated by the drip of IV machines in the hallway. I saw them immediately. My mother was slumped in a harsh plastic chair, her face a pale mask of exhaustion and genuine worry. Beside her, predictably, was Susan. Susan was wearing an outfit designed for performative grief. Soft gray cashmere, her eyes red, clutching a crumpled tissue. She was leaning heavily into my mother's side, demanding comfort even in this extremity. Susan saw me first. Her head snapped up, and the look of wounded sadness dissolved into a fleeting expression of surprise. quickly replaced by a vague, practiced look of spiritual suffering. My mother rose unsteadily, her eyes filling with tears that looked raw and real. "Carol," she whispered, taking a tentative step toward me. The sound of my name, spoken with such desperate need after months of silence, was deeply unsettling. I stopped 10 feet away from them, effectively freezing my mother's advance. I did not move to hug her, or even approach her. I looked directly at the doorway of the ICU. "How is he?" I asked, my voice flat and controlled, an echo of the professional tone I used with Miss Davis. My mother faltered, momentarily stunned by my absolute lack of warmth. Her maternal grief mixed instantly with guilt and shame. He stabilized about an hour ago. He's in the ICU, but he's resting. They won't let us see him yet." Susan detached herself from my mother and took a step toward me, clearly intending to launch into some manufactured plea for unity. I ignored her entirely. My gaze locked on my mother. "I'm glad he's stable," I said. "Keep me updated when the doctors return. I'll wait here." I sat down deliberately in a chair across the room, leaving a wide, unbridgeable expanse of beige linoleum between us. My mother swallowed hard, clearly grappling with whether to launch into a full emotional appeal. She saw the icy detachment in my eyes, the cold authority of a woman who had already walked away once. "Carol, I know you're angry," my mother finally whispered, her voice thick with regret. "We made a terrible mistake. Please can we put this aside for now? He needs his family whole. We need you." The plea was naked and desperate, entirely unlike the manipulative language she had used 6 months ago. But desperation didn't equate to apology, and need didn't equate to healing. "I am here for Dad," I stated, resting my purse firmly on my lap. "That is the only reason I am here, and the only subject I will discuss. If you or anyone else attempts to bring up the divorce, Rick, or Susan's involvement, I will leave, and I will not return. Is that understood?" Susan gasped, a small, dramatic sound. My mother looked down at the floor, seeing not her beloved forgiving daughter, but the resolute stranger she had created. The shame was palpable. She nodded slowly, defeat washing over her. "Understood, Carol." I settled back into the hard plastic chair. I was in the lion's den, but I had brought my own unbreakable shield. I didn't hate them in that moment. I simply accepted that they were part of the disaster I had to navigate. The air between us was thick and dangerous, but for the first time since this ordeal began, I knew exactly where the boundaries lay. The hardest battle, the one against my own emotional obligation, was about to begin. The silence that followed my declaration was heavy with all the months we had spent estranged. My mother retreated back to the chairs, but she didn't settle next to Susan. She sat 1 seat away, facing the doorway, avoiding my gaze. Susan, meanwhile, seemed to deflate. My complete dismissal of her presence was a far more powerful weapon than any shouted insult. She was accustomed to being the center of attention, the subject of drama. Being treated as an inert object seemed to genuinely baffle her. After 20 agonizing minutes, marked only by the infrequent squeak of a nurse's shoes, Susan mumbled something about needing fresh air, and slipped out of the waiting room. I watched her go, neither relief nor malice registering in my chest. She was simply gone. My mother remained rooted to her chair, twisting the diamond band on her finger. The veneer of the family matriarch had crumbled, revealing the scared, guilty woman beneath. She finally pushed herself up and walked slowly toward the area where I sat, stopping 3 feet away, respecting the physical boundary I had enforced. "I've been trying to call you, Carol," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "But I understood why you didn't answer." "I didn't answer because I had nothing left to say, Mother," I responded, keeping my voice low and even, just loud enough for the two of us. She fidgeted, struggling for the right words. "We were wrong. About Rick, about Susan, about everything. When you came to us 6 months ago, asking for support, we failed you. I failed you." The confession was monumental, a crack in the foundation of her lifelong commitment to appearance. But it wasn't enough. I looked directly into her tired eyes. What exactly was the failure, Mother? Be specific. She hesitated, her mouth working silently. The failure was telling you to forgive them. The failure was prioritizing the family name over your suffering. No, I corrected her gently, but firmly. The failure was believing that I was strong enough to absorb the blow so that your life wouldn't be inconveniently messy. The failure was treating me like the rock and Susan like the porcelain doll. Even when the doll was actively, maliciously destroying my life. You sacrificed my dignity for your own comfort, Mother. That was the core failure. Tears welled in her eyes, but I offered no tissue, no gesture of comfort. This time, she needed to own the pain of her mistake entirely. You're right, she admitted, the words catching in her throat. I was selfish and afraid. I was terrified of what the fallout would do to your father, and to us. I chose the lie because it was easier than confronting the truth of what Susan and Rick had become. Please, Carol, I am so sorry. For the first time, I understand that you walked away not out of spite but to save yourself. And I understand why. Her apology felt real, a genuine expression of regret, finally stripped of the manipulative undercurrents. It was the moment of accountability I had been fighting for, not just in court, but in the ruins of my personal life. I allowed a flicker of the cold steel in my heart to thaw, but only a fraction. Regret doesn't erase the last 6 months, Mother. Nor does it bring back the trust. But I am willing to acknowledge your apology for what it is. Now, we must talk about the future. I leaned forward slightly, planting my elbows on my knees. I was dictating the terms of engagement for any future relationship. I am here now because Dad is ill, and I love him, despite everything. But I need you to understand my position is non-negotiable. And if these terms are violated, I will walk away permanently, and there will be no second chance, regardless of anyone's health. She nodded eagerly, her eyes pleading. Anything, Carol, just tell me. First, Rick and Susan, they are dead to me. In every communication, every conversation, every interaction we may have from this day forward, their names, their lives, their supposed happiness, or their issues will never be mentioned. Never. They do not exist in the reality I share with Heather. If they try to contact me, they are immediately dismissed. If you try to act as a bridge or a mediator, I am gone. Understood, she whispered. Second, my decisions regarding the divorce, assets, custody, and the rebuilding of my life are sacrosanct. You will offer no judgment, no advice, and no subtle suggestions that I should be kinder or consider the family. You will respect my boundaries with absolute fidelity. You will support me unconditionally, or you will not support me at all. I paused, letting the weight of the demand sink in. Third, Heather. She comes first. Always. She is never to be subjected to discussions about the past, her father, or her aunt. If she chooses to see you, it will be on our terms, in neutral spaces, and you will prioritize her emotional stability above your desire to reconnect. You will not use her as leverage to force me back into the fold. I sat back, my posture one of complete control. I don't want your pity, Mother. I want your accountability. And I want your absolute unconditional adherence to these boundaries. Can you live by these rules? She looked at the ground for a long moment, processing the stark reality. Her only choice was submission to my terms, or total, irreversible isolation. The facade was completely gone. She was facing her daughter, a stranger she had created through her own weakness. When she lifted her head, the fear had been replaced by a weary resolve. Yes, Carol, I can. I will. I know I lost the right to be your mother in the traditional sense, but I want to earn the right to be in your life again, even if it's on your terms. I promise. The surgical relief was immediate. It was the sound of the last, critical tie, snapping clean. My fight had never been about winning an apology, it was about establishing the right to self-preservation without guilt. Good, I said simply. Then we can focus on Dad. Just then, the ICU doors opened, and a tired-looking doctor stepped out. My mother and I rose simultaneously. Two women united only by the man who lay fragile and still behind those sterile doors. The battle with her was over. Now, I could finally face my father. The doctor, a young man with exhausted eyes, spoke slowly and carefully. He's stable. The bypass was successful, but he suffered significant damage. He needs rest. And absolutely no stress. We can allow brief, scheduled visits. 5 minutes. One person at a time. My mother immediately deferred, stepping back without hesitation. Carol, you go first. He needs to see you. The deference was striking. 6 months ago, she would have argued for precedence, claiming her right as the wife, or attempting to leverage the visit for an emotional plea. Now, she simply acknowledged my authority, adhering instantly to the boundary of prioritizing my relationship with him. She was no longer fighting for the image. She was fighting for the thread of connection I offered. I nodded, acknowledging her compliance, and followed the nurse's guidance down the long, silent hallway. Walking into the ICU felt like crossing into a sacred, silent space. The room was dominated by machinery, beeping softly, keeping time with the fragile beat of his life. He looked small, terribly diminished by the medical apparatus. Tubes ran everywhere. Monitors glowed with essential, terrifying information. His strong, imposing frame was sunken into the mattress. His eyes were closed. And for a moment, I stood by the bedside, just watching him breathe, feeling the strange, painful mixture of deep affection and lingering hurt. This was the man who taught me to ride a bicycle, who swore I could fix anything, and who, when I needed him most, had failed to be the fixed point of righteousness I required. When I drew close, his eyelids fluttered open. He saw me, and a faint, tired smile touched his lips. He tried to speak, but the oxygen mask obscured his voice, making the attempt sound like a rasping groan. I gently placed my hand over his. It was frail and surprisingly cool beneath mine. I didn't mention the betrayal, the divorce, or the lawyer. I didn't burden him with the chaos he had indirectly helped create. I spoke only of simple, safe things. "I'm here, Dad," I whispered, leaning close so he could hear me over the mechanical hum. "The garden is coming along well. Heather is doing wonderfully in school. We painted your old office seafoam green. It's much brighter now." I told him about the mundane, the routine, the life I was aggressively building, brick by uncompromised brick. I was assuring him that my world, despite the destruction, was stable, strong, and entirely under my control. I was showing him the resilience he had always admired in me, proving that I survived the blow he was too afraid to acknowledge. I squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. A tiny, weak affirmation of our connection. A bond that transcended the last 6 months of hell. He tried to speak again. And this time, I heard a single, effortful word escape the mask. "Heather." Asterisk, always Heather. Asterisk, he was asking if she was safe, if she was okay. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes for the first time since the discovery. "She's safe, Dad. Completely safe. And she sends her love." That seemed to satisfy him. He closed his eyes again, his breathing settling into the rhythm of the machine. The nurse, who had been quietly monitoring the lines, gently informed me that my 5 minutes were up. I squeezed his hand once more and left the room, the silence of the hallway feeling loud and profound. When I rejoined my mother, the raw edge of my grief had been replaced by a focused resolve. I was no longer addressing a manipulator. I was addressing a cautious ally. "He's stable," I reported. He asked about Heather. My mother sighed, a heavy sound of relief and lingering anxiety. "I should go in." "Mother, wait," I said. "Before you go, I need to know you fully accept the terms we discussed. This isn't just about Dad's health. This is about establishing a functional, permanent reality. Rick and Susan are gone. They are never to be mentioned, never to be referenced, and never to be used as a point of comparison or leverage. Will you uphold that boundary, unconditionally?" She looked at me, her eyes red but clear. She had faced the cost of her earlier weakness, and she understood the finality of my demand. "Yes, Carol," she said. her voice firm. I will. I promise you. It was a mistake to ever put the reputation before you. We will focus only on what is real now. On you and on Heather. It was the true, hard-fought concession. The emotional blackmail had ended, replaced by a painful, necessary acknowledgement of truth. I didn't feel joy, but I felt the solid weight of control settling into place. Go to him then, I instructed. Tell him I'll be back tomorrow. I left the hospital and drove away from the sanitized tragedy of the ICU. My father's heart attack was a catalyst, forcing a confrontation that the legal system could never deliver. I had walked into the waiting room a wounded daughter, and walked out a boundary-setting adult. Finally free of the toxic obligation that had defined my role in the family. I had lost my husband, my sister, and the functional relationship with my parents as I once knew it. But I had gained my self-respect and the fierce, uncompromised safety of my daughter. The irony was devastating. The family they had sacrificed me to save was the one I had to destroy. To rebuild, stone by difficult stone, on my own hard-won terms. The hospital visit was the personal closure I needed. Now, I was ready for the final, brutal act of the legal process. The following week, Miss Davis and I met for the final settlement conference. Rick's lawyer, worn down by Miss Davis's relentless targeting of the financial fraud, was ready to concede on almost every major point. Rick's attempts to hide assets had been thoroughly exposed, crippling his ability to argue for an equal split. His reputation at work, while not destroyed, was severely tarnished. The financial consultant, who couldn't manage his own accounts. The custody agreement was settled first. Full primary custody of Heather to me, with structured supervised visitation for Rick based on mutually agreed-upon terms, and no exposure to Susan. The evidence of his financial recklessness ensured this victory was swift and clean. The house followed. Rick, desperate to end the legal bleeding and avoid the deeper investigation into the college fund embezzlement, agreed to sign over the title in exchange for a significantly reduced settlement. That was little more than a pittance compared to what he was legally entitled to. When Miss Davis finally slid the documents across the table, signed, notarized, and legally binding, I felt nothing but a cool, clear certainty. The house was mine. My daughter was safe. The fortress was complete. Congratulations, Carol, Miss Davis said, a rare, thin smile touching her lips. You won. No, I corrected, picking up the pen to sign the final papers. We secured the peace. Rick moved out of his temporary apartment and into Susan's, a pathetic, predictable ending for two people who thrived on shared victimhood and malice. They were tied together by debt and shared complicity, not genuine affection. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that their turbulent, toxic coupling hadn't lasted 6 months past the final decree. The thrill of the forbidden had evaporated when the consequences became real. My life with Heather settled into a genuine, vibrant rhythm. The seafoam green office was the anchor of our home, a space dedicated to creativity and shared truth. My father stabilized and was discharged, returning to a home where my mother, chastened and sincerely remorseful, was finally following my rules. My parents, now cautious and respectful, were re-entering our lives, but only at the safe distance I dictated. They saw Heather infrequently, always in public, and they never, ever mentioned the traitors. A few months later, Heather and I sat on the porch swing of number 412 Hemlock Lane, the house that had once housed a beautiful lie, now filled with an imperfect, hard-won truth. I looked out at the familiar suburban street, but I saw it differently now. It wasn't a cage built for protection. It was a home built for strength. I had lost the safe, predictable certainty of my old life, but I gained a ferocious, self-defined power. The ultimate victory wasn't the house, the money, or the custody. The true victory was the profound, quiet realization that I was no longer the character in the story written by my husband, my sister, or my parents. I was the author, and I was finally writing my own ending. The finality of the signed decree settled over me, not as euphoria, but as a clean, heavy certainty. Miss Davis and her team packed away their briefs. Their mission accomplished. Rick's legal resistance had collapsed entirely. He had traded the house and the majority of his assets for the swift cessation of the financial investigation. He was gone, professionally humbled and legally isolated, left with nothing but his shared burden of debt and complicity with Susan. Their fate, as I learned through distant neighborhood echoes, was predictably short-lived. The fever of their forbidden romance could not withstand the cold reality of shared financial ruin and the absence of my convenient, stable life to mock. The thrill evaporated, leaving two miserable people trapped by their own toxic choices. They were irrelevant, a detail of the past that no longer warranted my attention. My mother, true to her desperate promise in the sterile confines of the hospital waiting room, upheld the boundaries with absolute fidelity. She and my father were slowly and cautiously re-entering our lives, respectful visitors in a world I now controlled. They asked no questions about the past, offered no judgment on the present, and treated Heather's stability as the paramount concern. The toxic legacy of expectation and favor was finally broken. The seafoam green office, now bursting with Heather's chaotic, vibrant artwork, remained the anchor of our home, a space dedicated to creativity and shared truth. It was no longer a beautiful lie built on sand, but a fortress built on hard-won terms. A few months after the papers were signed, Heather and I sat on the porch swing of number 412 Hemlock Lane. I looked out at the familiar suburban street, but I saw it differently now. I had lost the safe, predictable certainty of my old life, but I gained something infinitely more valuable: a ferocious, self-defined power. The house, the money, the custody, these were merely the tangible proof of victory. The true victory was the profound, quiet realization that I was no longer the character written by my husband, my sister, or my parents. I was the author. And the story of my life was finally and fiercely my own.